At the Place de Republique Square in Paris, hundreds of men with placards stood relentlessly before their chief organiser, Luther. He was in his early 50s, well dressed in a sharp grey suit, and might look dapper were it not for tired lines pulling his face down to earth. Lines with stories to tell, none of them ending well. Luther took a moment to stare at the towering bronze statue of Marianne, the embodiment of the French Republic. She held an olive branch in one hand, while the other supported a tablet engraved with Droits de l'homme, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. How things had changed. France was no longer a safe place for men, yet it was here they were needed to be seen. Female police officers watched on coldly. There were at least 40 of them, armed with force shields and blasters. They wore red, except one, their leader, who was dressed in blue. Luther cleared his throat, then spoke. "We have not only lost our rights as men, but as humans. Soon we'll be no more than slaves." The men grunted agreement. No cheers, just anger. Their collective restlessness grew. Some of them were looking for a fight. "We will have equality again," Luther stated. "President Guiaraga is hard to sway, but sees reason. Let us focus on her rather than Isadora, for she's as cold as a stone." The policewoman in blue stepped forward. She was a mean, lean fighting machine with a snarl that would make a Doberman cower. Her New York police uniform was crisp, and the yellow braces she wore over them were distinct. "If you value your life, wrap this up, now," she barked. Luther shook his head and narrowed his eyes. The other men hissed but turned back to Luther. This was his show, and they would follow him to hell and back if he commanded it. "No, Saskia, we will not remain downtrodden. Positions of authority will be returned to men. We are equal to women." The men roused. There were shouts of agreement. Some shouts were directed at the police as something dark began to brew. Luther tried to calm it. A man had a placard with a picture of a child on it. It read, "Has anyone seen my son? I haven't." Saskia watched on, shaking her head. She brushed the side of her face. There was a small chirp in her ear. The same sound was also heard by a man in the crowd who touched at an earpiece, then responded with the slightest of nods. He suddenly brandished a weapon and fired at the policewoman. There was no commotion, no panic. Their shields deflected the energy weapon, forcing the beam to the ground in a shower of blue fire. They raised their guns at the rabble in calm unison. Saskia smiled, and her head bobbed. She saw Luther's face and knew at once he got it. This was a setup, and one he'd walked right into. "Wait, don't! He does not represent us. Violence is not our way," Luther pleaded. Saskia, weapon raised, lined Luther up. His eyes pleaded for mercy, but he deserved none. He was male after all. She didn't have orders to drop him, but drop him she would. He was supposed to be taken alive, made an example of. Yet here they were. Would her real boss be pleased at this? Likely not, yet it would be easier for all of them this way. Besides, what's one more dead man to add to the pile? France was the perfect backdrop for this operation. French law meant there would be few questions asked and fewer answered. "Be gone, filth," she mouthed, guilt unable to creep into her soul. Her hands were bloody, but the women she protected slept easily at night. The men dispersed, but it was too little, too late. Time froze as the policewomen opened fire. Saskia watched Luther, who made no attempt to run or hide. As the men around him fell, she slowly squeezed the trigger. At that moment, he looked into her eyes. In New York City, massive structures dominated the sky, towers so tall and bold they demanded attention. On them, audacious neon-like signage with Isadora Tech logos etched into the superstructures. It wasn't just a series of tall, gleaming towers. They stretched to infinity and ruled the skyline. One of the logos rested atop the tallest of them, could be seen from space. Futuristic ships flitted around the buildings. They were surrounded by bump fields bubbles that protected each ship. Buildings also had shields that flickered on if any ship came too near. Inside the tallest of these towers, Isadora, now in her early 40s and dressed in corporate garb, sat in a swanky office. She was still thin and fiery, now a cross between that agenda-laden pixie and a vexed demon. Her short hair was black like her nails, and she'd pierced her ears, nose and lip. She had a thin bow tattooed around her neck. Her office was a bit like her. Nothing was out of place. She put on a red scarf, and her sharp blue eyes scanned the cityscape through the window. She held out her hand and blinked. A 3D hologram of a woman who looked very much like Isadora appeared in her palm. Isadora's eyes twinkled with sadness as she remembered the woman. She looked up to the noise of someone approaching. She blinked with reluctance, and the image faded. A woman in similar attire entered. She was almost too immaculate to be human. Her long locks were golden brown, her lips were too full, and her face was both attractive and fake, all in one. She was too perfect, making her less than so, Isadora thought. People needed the marks and scars of life. It made them more attractive, not less. Making her this way had been a mistake. Her face didn't even move when she spoke. Isadora turned to face her. She crossed her legs and tapped her foot impatiently. "Well, Lucy, speak to me. They arrested him, I assume." Lucy's face seemed expressionless. "He is now deceased." Saskia pulled the trigger. Isadora sighed. She stood before Lucy and huffed. "That wasn't the plan." "Yet he is now dead. It has been confirmed." Isadora paced, perhaps to let out a pang of guilt, perhaps simply distracted. "Maybe he resisted. Maybe he tried something silly. Saskia was under orders, for fuck's sake." Lucy looked at her blankly with eyes like glass. Isadora went across to her and cupped her face with her hand. My luscious, why can't you be more conversational and less formal? Your artificial neural networks can do better. Life is more than a statistical model." Lucy bowed her head. "The essence of life eludes me. It is so intangible." "Tap into your deep deductive reasoning. Use your inference chip to make new pathways to access independent decision-making. Say something unexpected." Lucy stared at her blankly. Isadora came closer and licked the side of her face. "I gave you unsupervised feature extraction so you could derive or construct whatever you wanted to from the data." "I am learning," Lucy assured her. She took Isadora's face with her hands and boldly kissed her on the lips. "Better," Isadora said, "but use your recurrent and recursive neural networks for nonlinear activation functions and dimensionality reduction. In other words, surprise me." Lucy nodded. "I will aim to please." "Let's take it from the top. Take my chair." Lucy took Isadora's chair gingerly. Her expression was somewhere between puzzled and muddled. Isadora left the room and closed the door behind her. Lucy's eyes remained on the door. Her master hadn't returned. Was this a test? She interrogated her databanks and ran several models, seeking the most probable outcome. Bang! The door was kicked open, and Isadora entered, taking the role of her apprentice apparent. Lucy jumped in her seat. "Hey, the fucker's dead!" Isadora bellowed. Lucy looked at her uncomprehendingly. Isadora raised an eyebrow, compelling her to speak. "I assume Luther is no longer a problem?" "A verity," Isadora assured her. "We don't have to listen to that piece of shit babble about men's rights again. Ever." Lucy blinked, writing code to her chips. None of her models had predicted this outcome. She would divert all her deep learning to craft new models during the next shutdown.